Indian Summer of an Uncle is a short story comedy by Sir Pelham Grenville Wodehouse, published in 1930 in the short story collection Very Good, Jeeves. In the first-person perspective by Bertram Wooster. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The Indian Summer of an Uncle begins with Bertie's Uncle George, also known as Lord Yaxley, visiting him to announce his intention of getting married. After Uncle George departs, Bertie shares the news with his valet, Jeeves, who is already aware of it. Surprisingly, Jeeves knows the woman Uncle George plans to marry, Rhoda Platt. Both Bertie and Jeeves aren't thrilled about Uncle George marrying a younger woman, though Jeeves sees it as a temporary burst of youthful spirit. One must remember, however, that it is not unusual to find gentlemen of a certain age yielding to what might be described as a sentimental urge. They appear to experience what I may term a sort of Indian summer, a kind of temporarily renewed youth. Learning that Rhoda works as a waitress, Bertie worries about his classist Aunt Agatha's disapproval. Right on cue, Uncle George's sister, Aunt Agatha arrives, adamant about stopping the match. She forbids Bertie from involving Jeeves, believing family matters shouldn't drag in servants. Aunt Agatha recalls a similar situation in the past, where the family paid off a girl to leave Uncle George when he fell for a barmaid. To ensure history doesn't repeat itself, she hands Bertie a blank check to pay off Rhoda. Bertie pays a visit to Rhoda's home, where he meets her pleasant aunt who first mistakes him to be a doctor. Bertie lacks the courage to offer money and leaves. Disheartened by his inability, Bertie returns to Aunt Agatha, who expresses her disappointment. Despite Aunt Agatha's disapproval, Bertie seeks counsel from Jeeves, who suggests a plan. Introducing Uncle George to Rhoda's aunt, who will continue to reside with Rhoda post-marriage, might lead Uncle George to reconsider. Aunt Agatha dismisses Jeeves, scolding Bertie for involving him. Ignoring her, Bertie proceeds with Jeeves's idea and orchestrates a meeting between Rhoda's aunt and his uncle at his flat. Bertie learns that Jeeves knows a valet named Smethurst, who desires to marry Rhoda. However, Rhoda is undecided between her love for Smethurst and her aspiration to marry into nobility. As Rhoda's aunt, Mrs. Wilberforce, arrives, Bertie is shocked to discover her past engagement to George Wooster. Feeling uneasy, Bertie attempts to cancel lunch, but Uncle George shows up. Their encounter is unexpectedly joyous as Mrs. Wilberforce and Uncle George reunite fondly. Overwhelmed, Bertie escapes to the Drones Club, where he receives a surprising call from Aunt Agatha, revealing Uncle George's decision to marry Mrs. Wilberforce, an age-appropriate woman whom she mistakenly believes to be from a distinguished family. In a confrontation with Jeeves, Bertie learns of Smethurst requesting Jeeves to intervene in Uncle George's affair with Rhoda. Jeeves believes in the compatibility between Mrs. Wilberforce and Uncle George. To evade Aunt Agatha's ire, Jeeves suggests a getaway trip, a proposal Bertie agrees to. Let's analyze Indian Summer of an Uncle. Jeeves serves as the capable valet to Bertie Wooster, a wealthy and leisurely young man living in London. Despite lacking any obligation to do so, Jeeves takes pleasure in assisting Bertie with his dilemmas with his excellent alternative schemes. Maintaining an unwaveringly composed and polite manner, Jeeves embodies the epitome of a gentleman's servant. Displaying competence and respectfulness that Bertie can candidly discuss his family matters with him in a cozy talk. His articulate speech, complete with proper titles for aristocrats, enhances his gentlemanly aura, such as his reference to Aunt Agatha as Mrs. Spencer Gregson. Bertie describes Jeeves as shrewd, persuasive and compelling, who counsels Bertie. Jeeves standing there with the light of intelligence simply fizzing in every feature, I suddenly felt how perfectly footling it was to give this preeminent source of balm and comfort. I have always been accustomed to look upon you as a counselor without equal. I have, so to speak, hung upon your lips. There are several references to the great poets and verses, namely, Robert Burns, Alfred Tennyson, William Wordsworth and Shakespeare. Jeeves devises his scheme, based on the psychology of the individual, meticulously analyzing the personalities involved. Such as he bringing Uncle George and Mrs. Wilberforce to the dais of matrimony and a second chance in life. I fancy that Mrs. Wilberforce should make an ideal mate for his lordship. Bertie typically remains oblivious to the extent of Jeeves's scheming until the story's end. Jeeves often appears to possess knowledge beyond what he reveals, swiftly taking charge of situations before others can intervene. While he typically discloses his manipulations to Bertie afterwards, he selectively withholds details, such as his not revealing the fact that he knew Mrs. Wilberforce to be the barmaid whom the family had previously paid off to not marry Uncle George. Portrayed as a pragmatically Machiavellian character, Jeeves occasionally delays problem-solving until it aligns with his interests, such as his helping Smethurst, who is greatly attached to the young person, is an intimate friend of Jeeves. Overall, Jeeves tends to orchestrate outcomes for the betterment of all involved. Uncle George and Mrs. Wilberforce get a second chance in life at happiness. Smethurst can now choose Smethurst for marriage. Aunt Agatha is somewhat content at Uncle George's engagement announcement to Mrs. Wilberforce, and Bertram Wooster goes on a getaway trip to escape Aunt Agatha. Both Bertie and his Aunt Agatha belong to the noble class of society who are deeply class-conscious and look down upon those belonging to the social class lower than them. Upon learning that Rhoda is a waitress at his lordship's club, Bertie's first reaction is of terrible shock as he exclaims, "My God! The proletariat," although Jeeves corrects him that it is actually the lower middle classes, sir, to no avail. Aunt Agatha is a very much the grande dame of the old regime and is horrified at the idea of George's intention to marry a young woman from the working class, whom she deems below both George and their family's status. Social hierarchy is significant for Aunt Agatha, prioritizing her lineage over George's potential marital bliss. She cannot consider the help as someone who could give sound advice, as she berates Bertie for being a Wooster who could lower the prestige of the clan by allowing menials to get above themselves. She is firmly against the idea of discussing this intimate family matter with your manservant, regardless of Jeeves' exceptional problem-solving skills. Aunt Agatha had prejudices against discussing family affairs with the staff. Despite her disdain for seeking counsel from a servant, Aunt Agatha's sense of superiority based on her social standing is apparent throughout the story. Her willingness to offer financial incentives to influence others suggests a belief that everyone, especially those of lower social standing, can be swayed by money. She proposes to offer Rhoda money to leave George alone. Bertie loses his morale, shirks his responsibilities towards the family, and relies heavily on Jeeves to solve his problems. After learning of Uncle George's engagement with Mrs. Wilberforce, Bertie anticipates yet another impending disaster, one that will likely prompt Aunt Agatha to enlist his help. Remembering his initial inclination when Aunt Agatha sought advice about George's relationship with Miss Platt, Bertie plans to stick to his original strategy, fleeing the scene. And, what's worse, she will lug me into the mess. There is only one thing to be done. Pack the toothbrush and let us escape while we may, leaving no address. Bertie aims to evade any responsibility and escape the inevitable dilemma he foresees. He has a history of dodging what Aunt Agatha views as his duties. It is quite time you did something for the family. Bertie prefers to delegate such matters to others, particularly relying on Jeeves to solve problems. This dependency on Jeeves extends beyond what might be considered typical for an aristocratic gentleman and his humble servant. Bertie often leaned heavily on Jeeves to address the George Miss Platt situation. Hope you like, share and subscribe for more videos.